And tonight's tale. There is always light in the dark, isn't there? The Covenant, Part 2. The figure stood with its back to me, about halfway around the loop that made up the lantern room of the lighthouse, facing out towards the ocean, its arm moving swiftly in a series of practice motions and movements about the switches that were built into the workbench. As I stood at the top of the stairs, one hand still gripping the railing, it made no notice of me. I swallowed hard, and then cleared my throat loudly and addressed the figure. "What are you doing up here?" I asked, forcing myself to sound more confident than I felt. The figure jolted, as if startled, then began to slowly turn around to face me. The large, open windows, bathing it in light from behind where the sun was making its descent into the sea on the horizon, causing a shadow to cloud over its face, not obscuring it, but certainly dulling the details somewhat. "Oh, you must be Elijah." The deep, growling voice reached my ears as though filled with animosity, but the face it belonged to quickly cracked into a welcoming smile. The voice belonged to a man that appeared to be in his late 40s, with broad shoulders that sported a pair of arms that were definitely familiar with manual labour. He stood some 5'1", if my guess was correct, and his jaw sported a thick cropping of facial hair that wrapped round his chin and mouth in a style that Ashley would have called wolfy. The stranger held out a large, calloused hand in my direction and started making his way towards me. Still somewhat confused, I took my hand off the railing and extended my own hand, hastily making my way across to help him close the distance, lest my man card be revoked by my failure to return the gesture. We shook briefly, and he introduced himself as Devlin. He explained that he worked for Mrs. Geraldine, and had been the one tasked with operating the light every night while a replacement caretaker was found, and also did little odd jobs here and there, like collecting the outgoing mail. "I heard through the grapevine in town that you all arrived early, so I came up to collect the form from you. When I saw you weren't here, I figured I had better head up and get the light running for the night." He chuckled a bit at the worried look on my face, but then clapped me on the back cheerfully. "Hey, buddy, don't worry. As far as I'm concerned, you weren't meant to start work until tomorrow night," he assured me. I breathed a sigh of relief and thanked him. It would be nice to have someone around that knew what they were doing the first night that I had to turn on the light anyway, and I told him as much. His face lit up and his eyes twinkled a bit with an excited passion as he showed me around the workbench and all its dials and switches and cages, giving me a full rundown on what everything was for and how it all worked together. He'd been tending the lighthouse, off and on, for the past 15 years, he said, whether it was between caretakers, and had taken a real liking to the operation. It was definitely a relief to have someone there, to make sure I didn't mess up too badly the first night, and to run me through the process. And when we flipped the big switch on the workbench, which Devlin continued to call the dash, the brilliantly bright lights of the Stalward sprang into life, flooding the lantern room and piercing out for miles into the ever-darkening night sky. A metal contraption that the light sat upon began to rotate slowly, with a steady, soft humming sound, and I grinned at Devlin at the success. He returned the grin with another thunderous clap on the shoulder for a job well done, then gave me his number to program into my phone so that I could reach him any time in case I had questions or ran into trouble, which I greatly appreciated. Before I followed him down the stairs to the ground floor and showed him out. He was parked just up the street, he said, and as I looked out into the quickly gathering darkness, we could vaguely see a truck-like shape just a little ways down from the gate. Devlin said he would lock up the gate behind himself and wish me luck on my first night before setting out across the grounds. I watched him go and gave a stout wave as he locked up the gate before closing the door and making my way back upstairs. We found Ashley in the second floor living room, seated on the couch and leaning over a box of picture frames. She was taking them out one by one, unwrapping them from the newspaper and bubble wrap and setting them into a stack on the coffee table. She smiled up at me when I crossed over the landing and strode towards where she sat, taking a seat for myself. "Well, honey, what do you think?" "Pretty great, huh?" I asked, leaning back against the familiar tan plush of the sofa, feeling rather pleased with myself. I told her about getting the light on with the help of Devlin, and how I could never have imagined how fortunate it was that Mrs. Geraldine really did seem to have everything sorted out and set up for us. My wife beamed and returned the sentiment before climbing her way onto my lap to kiss me. Some hours later, I was roused from sleep, having made her way into our bedroom on the floor just below the light box, by the persistent droning sound of an alarm. We sat up in bed, facing out the large bay window that opened towards the sea for a moment, in confusion. Then it registered to me that the slowly spinning lights from the lantern room did not shine on their slow and measured rotation by the window and out over the dark and swirling waters of the blackened sea. I leapt up, quickly jumping into my pants, which were so hastily discarded earlier, and raced out of the bedroom and up the stairs to the lantern room. No sooner had I placed my foot on the landing at the top of the lighthouse than the alarm stopped ringing in my ears as my eyes took in the scene of the lantern room. Empty, save for the workbench and the black binder, save for the various knobs and switches and gauges of the lighthouse operation and radio, save for the microphone that you would speak into to use the radio, and of course the slowly turning metal mechanism that rotated the lights was topped by the brightly lit lamps of the Stalward, which shone out of the windows for miles as it continued its even never-ending rotation. It wasn't that the light had sprung back to life as I approached. Rather, it was that the light had never gone out in the first place. I rubbed my eyes and made my way over to the workbench to flip through the binder, looking for what might cause the alarm to go off besides the light going out. After 45 minutes of flipping, I found nothing useful regarding the alarm. Apparently, It was only meant to go off when the light was out. I rubbed the back of my neck, and I figured that I would have to call for repairs in the morning. Surely, something was off with the alarm. It had been a while since the last caretaker at the Stalward, according to Devlin. And since the alarm had gone off in the early hours of the morning, when it would have normally sat abandoned, no one had been around enough to realise that it had been going off. Who knew how long it had been malfunctioning? Given that the alarm was clearly on the fritz, I resolved to stay out of bed to keep an eye on the light for the rest of the night, and made my way down the stairs to the kitchen in search of coffee, hoping that Ashley had already unpacked the maker. With a yawn and a stretch, I blessed my wife, for there it was, sitting on the counter, along with a mug, a spoon, the sugar bowl, and a little tin of coffee grounds. She was so good to me. As I stood in the kitchen, waiting for the coffee maker to do its thing, my eyes tracked the slow movement of the beams from the lighthouse at the top of the tower as they swung round and around in a never-ending dance, washing the crowns and the sea in a stream of illumination. It was truly marvellous, bordering on magical, I thought. The way the light could cut so strongly through the darkness, stretching out for miles and miles. There was a metaphor there, I was sure of it, but I was no poet. A few minutes later, we began the climb once more back into the lantern room on the 8th floor, cup in hand and thighs burning from exhaustion. I was in fairly good shape, but going up that many flights this early in the morning was truly brutal. I slipped into the bedroom for a moment to grab my phone, careful not to wake Ashley, and had to resist the urge to climb back into bed with her. How I longed for the quiet warmth of those blankets and her form snuggled in against mine. I made my way back up to the lantern room and resolved that next time I went downstairs, I was going to bring a chair up here to sit in at the workbench. Ah well, I climbed up and sat on the workbench once more and looked at my phone. It was a little after 4 in the morning. I shot a quick text to the number that I had programmed in for Devlin, apologising for the timing and asking if the alarm had a tendency to go off for no apparent reason. While I was fine to call for the repair, I admit I was hoping to avoid looking like an idiot if I had just tripped a setting unknowingly and making a big fuss out of nothing. Devlin didn't respond immediately, and I didn't expect him to. It was 4 a.m. after all, and I felt lucky enough to even have someone to contact at all. Feeling glad that I didn't rouse the poor man from his sleep, I buried myself in the manual once again and set about trying to learn the radio procedures while savouring the steaming mug of coffee that I had brought with me. I thought I was getting a fairly decent grasp on at least the basics, and was just hoping that I would never actually need to use any of it, when the sound of radio static blasted from a speaker nearby, startling me from the manual and sending a tingle of excitement through me. We crept down off the bench at once and crossed the few paces to where the radio was set up, my left hand reaching for a dial that would adjust the frequency and bring the broadcast in clear. I spun the knob slowly to the right, hearing a staticky, garbled mess that was unintelligible, before I spun the knob to the left even more slowly, hoping and praying that would clear up enough to make sense of the signal. I was treated to nothing more than a few syllables that were stretched and full of static so extreme that I could not even venture a guess as to what language was being spoken. Frantically, I tried a second, smaller dial next to the first. Finally, I got some small bit of success.
Starboard 37.25. No improvement. Over.
The voice on the radio was warped by my bad tuning and thickly accented, though I could not for the life of me begin to guess what nationality ship it might be coming from. I grabbed the small microphone and held down the red button at its base to speak, and gave it my best shot. This is the Stalward. Please repeat transmission. Over. I hadn't heard the full message, but whatever it was, it sounded, if not dire, certainly unpleasant. The manual said that I was to repeat the vessel's name 3 times as standard procedure, but I hadn't heard the name of the vessel in all my fumbling to get the radio tuned into the proper frequency. I waited in silence for a few moments, holding my breath, hoping that whatever had transmitted would respond. I could feel the seconds seem to slow down as I waited. On my forehead, little beads of sweat began to pick their way through my pores as my brow furrowed in concentration. My ears strained for the smallest of sounds, as if hoping to pick up on the clicking of the radio as that first touch of transmission came in. Every nerve in my body was alight with some internal fire, as if lightning were sparking off of every receptor in my body. My muscles tightened where I stood, coiled tightly with the urge to spring, or to run, or to fight as I waited, the soft whooshing sound of my own heartbeat filling my ears, as my eyes stayed glued to the radio, laser focused for any sign of retransmission, until the soft thrumming sound of the light behind me, as it continued its slow and steady rotation, became like a march of drums, of war drums, in my ears, drowning out all reason and thought, and leaving nothing but the unrelenting thunder. As the intensity swelled in the room around me, and I began to lose my balance from the never-ending spinning of the light, dark, light, dark, light again, droned on before me. The ringtone of my cell phone cut through it all and snapped me out of whatever hypnotic hysteria was beginning to take over. I picked it up at once and was actually relieved to hear the gruff, growling Devlin on the other side.
Hey there, Devlin. Listen, I'm sorry if I woke you up.
I immediately started apologising into the phone, wiping my forehead on a sleeve and trying to clear my mind of whatever dream had started to slip just a moment ago into. For his part, Devlin assured me that he was an early riser. It wasn't a problem. All the typical pleasantries. As I had originally suspected, the alarm would need to be checked out for repairs, and Devlin recommended that I stay up with the light until I could get someone out to take a look, just in case the light happened to go out. I assured him that I was doing just that, and then I told him about the radio transmission. He went oddly silent for a moment before responding.
Sounds like you might have accidentally turned to a military station. I wouldn't worry about it. Just turn back to 160, 600, and leave it there for the rest of the night.
Otto, a military station? That couldn't be good. And I hoped that I wasn't about to get a very hangry call from Mrs. Charlton in the morning, as I switched the radio back as suggested. Man, was I lucky to have Devlin around. We rung off the call with a promise that I wouldn't hesitate to get in contact with him again if I needed anything, and Devlin's assurances that he'd send someone out to look at the alarm for me once the sun was up, and the town along with it for the day. We stayed in the lantern room until the sun was welly and truly up for the day, and then we switched off the light. There was no more radio disturbance. I met Ashley in the kitchen with the kids a while later, where breakfast consisted of toasted bagels and peanut butter. Our groceries were meant to arrive around 11 that morning, and all we really had was some of the dried and non-perishable food that we had brought with us on the trip. After breakfast, Ashley sent the kids upstairs to the new computer room with instructions to start setting up their PCs so that they could get back to their schooling. When we were alone, I wrapped my arms round her waist from behind and kissed her neck, telling her that I was surprised the alarm didn't wake her up. She blushed as she turned around, apologising that I had to get up and deal with it all by myself. I supportive for her own good sometimes, my darling wife. I assured her it wasn't that big of an issue, and we'd be expecting a repair service at some point this morning, so that she wouldn't be alarmed when they showed up. Ashley and I parted ways a little while later on the stairs. She headed to supervise the children's homeschooling centre construction, and I to take a much needed shower. Once I was dried and dressed, I made my way down the stairs again to put my shoes on. Ashley had decreed that all shoes were banned in the house, and were to be left in the little hallway that led towards the door, and so I stooped awkwardly in the hallway to get my boots on before heading out. The sea air was refreshingly crisp as I stepped out into the morning, the grass crunching softly beneath my boots, where the dew or the sea spray, or some combination of the two, had crystallised in the chill of the night. I was not accustomed to such freezing occurring at the end of August, but then again, I wasn't from the north, nor was I used to living so close to the sea. I supposed that the wind coming off the sea must get pretty chilly. I made my way slowly across the grounds, heading towards the storage shed that the movers had hauled our unneeded table, chairs, and several other pieces of items to that Ashley had directed them. If you're going to have long nights up in the lantern room, I was damn well going to have a chair up there. I might as well carry two in, so that Ashley or one of the kids would have a place to sit as well if they were decided to join me. I was sure they would all find the view to be spectacular in the same way that I did. The grounds were only slightly frosted and melting quickly with the warmth of the sun as it made its climb into the sky. And I could see that it was going to be more than a little effort on my part, to whip this land into any sort of decent shape. While the land had looked fairly smooth from afar at first glance, walking across it, I quickly realised that the earth itself contained many ruts and small little molehills every few steps that would certainly make taking a lone moor, however at all, quite a challenge. Unless it was flattened out. Hours of back-breaking labour in my future. I finally pulled up to the shed and the large sliding door that faced the lighthouse. Wrapping my hand around its large metal handle, I gave a tug to open it. It was stiffer than I expected, and it screeched horribly as the wheels turned against each other without enough lubrication. Little flecks of dust drifted down from the upper track as the light made its way into the small space. Sure enough, there were signs inside, with our things. Squeaking of mice, no doubt. That was expected, I suppose. But what was unexpected was the weird shape at the back wall of the shed. Several of them, in fact. Pressed up tightly against the far wall and covered in protective white sheets that had gone somewhat grey with the dust that had settled upon them, there were several large objects that looked as though they must be some sort of furniture. A hutch or two, perhaps, or else a large wardrobe left behind by a previous occupant, I supposed. I was interested in checking out the large, tall, rectangular shapes, but did not look forward to the idea of having to drag them single-handedly across the grounds and up the stairs if Ashley decided she wanted to make use of them. I wasn't going to keep the discovery from her, of course. Just, wait until we were a bit more settled and I wasn't feeling so exhausted from the short night of sleep. We dragged two of our dining room chairs out of the shed and stacked them together on the uneven grass outside the shed, then tugged at the door to close it. It took a lot more effort to close than it did to open, that was for sure. But eventually, after applying some leverage and a lot more screeching protest of metal, it was sealed up tight. I would definitely be needing some WD-40 in the near future. I picked up my small stack of chairs and began making my way back across the grounds towards the lighthouse, already dreading the 8 floors that I would have to take them up, and wondering to myself how difficult it would be to actually get one of those elderly star shower lifts installed when my foot came down awkwardly on a little mound in the grass and my ankle rolled, sending me staggering forward, chairs and all. I nearly fell off to the left, clear and away from the chairs. But, fortunately for me, I have the reflexes of a ninja and managed to regain enough of my balance that I fell forward towards the chairs instead, smacking my forehead against the corner post of the backrest and splitting a nice little gash into my forehead just above my right eyebrow. I hissed in pain for a moment as the stinging sensation spread through the top half of my face, and a slow trickle of warm blood started to creep down my face. Great. Truly excellent. I reached up to wipe the blood off my face and away from my eye with my sleeve, and picked up the chairs again and made my way towards the lighthouse once more. I wasn't about to have to walk all the way back for them a second time. As I crashed my way through the door, chairs still in hand, I called out for Ashley, whose head appeared over the side of the railing, looking down the stairs at me quizzically. Then she took notice of the blood that was now streaming down my face, and came running, words of concern flying, as she bustled around the kitchen at once, pulling a first aid kit from a half-unpacked box near the sink. I assured her that I was fine. It didn't hurt that badly, and that I was simply pissed off at my clumsiness, while she set about cleaning and dressing my wound. Fortunately, it wasn't going to require stitches, and after a few minutes of Ashley's careful attentions, I was good as new and ready to go. We thanked her with a hug and a kiss to her forehead, then valiantly picked up the chairs and started to climb up to the 8th and topmost floor of the lighthouse. Had to look like the big strong man in front of my darling wife. That climb seemed to take forever. My feet felt heavy, like massive blocks of lead that required almost Herculean effort to lift, attached at the bottom of worthless legs, which were, I was certain, comprised of nothing more than limp spaghetti for all the leverage and assistance that they offered to the task. Each star was nearly insurmountable, like the tallest of mountains, as I struggled to find the strength to lift my weight higher. The muscles in my arms burned with exertion and trembled from holding the pair of chairs, as though I had become Atlas himself in a feeble attempt to raise the world onto my shoulders. My skin flushed with heat, and sweat beaded on my brow, dripping down slowly to sting my eyes as breath whooshed violently in and out of my heaving chest. My shoulders stooped and rounded forward, with the effort of keeping my arms aloft as they shook, slowly at first, and then more violently with each passing second that seemed to stretch into eternity, as that telltale whooshing of my own heartbeat sounded in my ears like the wheels of a train coming down a long, enclosed tunnel. My field of vision began to narrow as I huffed and I puffed my way up the stairs. Each movement of my body, each tiny motion, every inch of contracted muscle exerted to make my journey, caused the creeping black ring at the edge of my vision to contract, swelling in its darkness, threatening to block out the light entirely as I struggled time was meaningless as I pressed onward over the stars. My sense of balance was skewed with the twisting and winding staircase, that summitless destruction, that never-ending spiral, and every fibre of my being was set alight with the burning of muscle burned past its limit, until I was little more than a stack of pines that screeched against each other on the parsed lines of sinew, crying out for lubrication and the fight to reach the light at the top. Thoughts of my family flashed before my eyes and lingered on Ashley's smile the day that I had picked her up from prom. That secret smile she always saved just for me. And I thought it would be fitting that this should be the very last thing that I would ever see in my life. The happiness that I was able to bring her.